Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Beneath the Surface. Today we'll be discussing the current situation in Palestine. Joining us on the show from Italy is a producer called YasminPerni. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start off with what's taking place in Palestine today.
These days there is a serious escalation of violence in Jerusalem in particular, but also since the summer. It started with the 3 settlers that were kidnapped, and Israel immediately accused Hamas of having kidnapped them, and as an excuse Israel started going after Hamas in the West Bank, arresting more than 500 people. Then there was the attack on Gaza, and the escalation is just continuing. A few days ago, a Palestinian girl and a boy were blinded. One was shot in the head. 2 days ago, a Palestinian man was hung by settlers, I think it was, found hanging at the bus station. A few days ago, there was this attack on the synagogue and the yeshiva, the religious school, on Har Nof, which is a neighborhood. It's the site of Deir Yassin. And everybody who knows the Palestinian history knows what Deir Yassin is. Deir Yassin is a village that in 1948 was made as an example to the rest of the Palestinian villages. And so this escalation is very dangerous, and I'm wondering if someone is benefiting from this escalation.
As the Israelis already attacked Palestine over the summer, why do you think they're provoking the Christians and the Muslims in Jerusalem today?
I think someone is benefiting from an escalation of violence. I don't really know what the plan is, but I see that there is a desire. The settlers are given a free hand at the violence that they can commit, and nobody is being taken, made accountable for that.
There was a time when the media and politicians would be afraid to speak about what's taking place in Palestine and what Israel is doing and what it's committing, the violence it's committing to the Palestinian people. Do you think there's become a bit of a change, that the media is kind of focusing on Palestine as well and giving the truth of what's actually happening in Palestine?
We're still a very long way away from reporting both sides equally. I think that at the BBC this summer there was a lot of demonstrations because people were unhappy at the way the BBC was portraying the Gaza attack. If you follow the mainstream media, I think that you still don't get the full picture. For example, people still didn't hear about this man who was hung 2 days ago. But there is, I think, an increase in alternative information channels. There is Twitter, there is Facebook, there is blogs, there is journalists who put out their articles on the internet and are free to read for everybody. One of them is Ali Abu Nima and Electronic Intifada, who is really keeping track of the Palestinian side of the events. So I think this is very positive, that people have a chance now to go and hear the other side that has been silenced for so long.
Journalists who actually, try and write as much as they possibly can about the events taking place in Palestine, aren't their lives at risk from the Israelis?
No, I don't think your life is at risk unless you're in a conflict situation and you can get shot. But that's if you are between Palestinian stone throwers and Israelis who are shooting rubber bullets or live ammunition or even gas canisters. What is it called? Sorry.
That's fine.
The canisters for the one with the air. What is it called?
I've forgotten exactly what it's called myself.
Anyway, these canisters that they should be shooting them in the air for the smoke, but actually they're also shooting them at people, and some people have been killed. When I was in Belain, 1 year, it was a few years ago now, during the demonstrations, an American human rights activist, ISM, the Solidarity Movement, was hit straight in the head the day that we were there. and his name is Tristan Anderson, and he lost part of his brain.
Oh, that's very sad.
Yes, and he's still in a vegetative state. He's a vegetable.
At the time, was this actually broadcast when this actually took place to an American?
It was broadcast, but it wasn't broadcast the way it should be broadcast. It wasn't. I think if it had been a Jewish person who had been hit like that, it would be front page everywhere. Unfortunately, it seems like the lives of the Palestinians are not worth the same as the life of the Israelis.
That is the situation which we see, and many people who tend to speak the truth of what's taking place in Palestine are labelled as anti-Semitic, which is why some people tend to keep away from reporting the truth or from, speaking how they actually feel about the Israelis themselves. Do you think it's fair for someone to be called anti-Semitic when they're not actually, targeting or attacking the Jews themselves, but they're attacking what the Israeli government and the Zionists are doing to the Palestinians?
I think that calling someone an anti-Semite just because they want to speak out as to what they see is a way of trying to smear everything with a brush and trying to silence them. Palestinians are Semites. If we want to go into the root of everything, Palestinians are Semites just like the Jews, the Sephardi Jews, because the Ashkenazi, of course, are coming from Europe, so that's a different story. So calling them anti-Semites anti-Semitic has taken on its own significance, but to be Arab is a Semite, so you're anti-Palestinian and you're anti-Israeli would be the same.
So most of the media tends to cover Palestine and the events taking place in Palestine as a more of a Muslim versus Jew or Jew versus Muslim. What about the Christians? Because there are many Christians in Palestine, but we never hear their perspective or we never know what's actually going on in their cities. Can you tell us more about them, please?
Yes. Well, the Muslims and the Christians mainly live together. They don't live in separate cities. They live pretty much mixed. There might be a neighborhood that has more Christians, neighborhoods that have more Muslims. Christians are actually very few. Christians have decreased from 1948. They were about maybe 16-17%, depending on the statistics and how you count. The Ottomans were not counting very carefully the census. It was all a political thing. But now they're down to 1%. So there are very few Christians left. There are about 170,000 Palestinians left between Israel and Palestine.
That's decreased a lot since 1948.
Oh, yes.
How come did they migrate to other countries?
Yeah, they were made refugees after 1948. All the houses in West Jerusalem were belonging to the more affluent Palestinians, and a lot were Christian, and a lot of course, were also Muslim families like the Husseini family and things like that. But a lot of the Christians were quite wealthy in 1948, and they were made homeless, their villages. I did a film on Palestinian Christians, which focused on the Christians themselves. It's a story from Palestinian people from 1948 to now, but it gives voice to the Palestinian Christians. And you will see in the film that they have suffered the same. There is no distinction for occupation between Christians and Muslims.
Of course not, but then as the number has decreased, like you were saying that it's around 17% of the population it used to be back in 1948, but now it's just 1%. So were they kind of forced to leave Palestine before? Yeah,
like all Palestinians, they were forced to leave. Muslims had to leave and Christians had to leave. All the Palestinians they tried to get rid of everybody from the Galilee. There was the operation that happened around Kfar Biram, which is the Palestinian village that I focus on in the documentary, was called Operation Broom, Meknissa. Sweep the Palestinians out of the land. Just the name of the operation. You can find it in the Israeli documents. It's called Meknissa.
How come, Palestine was a very big country. There are many places and many cities that didn't have, a vast majority of people living in those cities. So for them to remove people from that specific area and call it Operation Broom, it's kind of surprising. Like, why did they want to remove the Palestinians themselves from those cities? And this is in the beginning.
Yeah, well, the plan was to get the land without the people. This was the plan from the beginning. It's trying to get rid of the Palestinians. There is now, for example, there is a study by Ilan Pappé. He wrote a book. He goes village by village of what the Haganah and the Stern and the Israeli, they were not Israel before, they were Jewish gangs. They were coming in, and Deir Yassin is one of these villages that was hundreds of people, I think, 120 women and children were killed, massacred. And one is Kfar Beram, where they bombed the village, so people could not go back. More than 520 villages were depopulated, people driven out, forest built on top of them, allowed, by the Jewish National Fund, collected money from Europe and America to plant trees onto these villages so that you don't recognize that the villages are underneath. There is an Israeli filmmaker who made a film called The Village Under the Forest, and it talks about how they discovered that there was a village under the forest that is planted. It's all nice, beautiful, and green. Kfar Beram is now a national park. You can still go and see the houses demolished, but it looks very nice and green because, of course, if you let the vegetation grow, nature takes over.
Of course.
So,
but what do you think the Israelis gained from demolishing the homes of the Christians and the Muslims in Palestine?
So they couldn't go back. They demolished the villages, so the people had to flee.
Because there was a film that they made called The Promise, where a British girl goes to Israel, and she actually meets a few Palestinian people, which they still have the key of their home. Back in 1948 or like 1960s, they still have their key, hoping that one day they would actually go back. Like, as you met a lot of people, do they still have that hope of them returning home?
They still have the hope of returning home, and many of them still have the key to their house. Many of them still have the keys. And on Nakba Day, on the day of the tragedy, the day that they were, their state was declared gone, Palestine was divided. That's called the Nakba Day. I mean, for the Israelis, it's a day of joy because they got the state, but for the Palestinians, it's a very sad day because it's the day that they lost their land and their homes, not physically on that day, but that's the day when the UN decided that they didn't have the right to be there.
How come the UN decided such a, it's very cruel, because the fact that firstly the Palestinians were driven from their home, that is something not humane at all. But at the same time, for Palestine to be not recognized as Palestine anymore, and this being done by the UN, it's very surprising, because the whole point of the UN then just becomes like, people start to question it, like you're meant to be, helping people, not, allowing others to take over and oppress people.
I think that the UN thought that it was dividing the country equally, but it ended up that Palestinians lost majority of their land.
But then if they were to divide, shouldn't have they enforce the two-state solution?
Well, I think the thing is actually that the Palestinians were not involved in this decision in the UN. It was done, all these decisions were taken without the Palestinian. Yeah, the two-state solution should have been, now I think it's too late. We are already in a de facto one state because Israel is already controlling the West Bank. The West Bank after Oslo was divided in Area A, B, and C. Area A is supposed to be under the Palestinian control, but even in those areas, the Palestinians don't really have complete control of the situation. The Israelis, they do night raids, they come and arrest children in the middle of the night for having thrown stones, or just to intimidate people in general. If they think someone is Hamas, they will come and arrest him in the middle of the night. This is inside Area A. So the Palestinian Authority itself does not have full control of Area A. And then there is Area B, in which it's mixed control, and then Area C, which is the majority of the West Bank, which is under Israeli control.
So if we're to look at Palestine now, it's more of a one state than actual, two states in a way. Even though, of course, the Israelis are not treating the Palestinians as, you know, equal to others?
Okay, if you talk about Palestine as the West Bank, it's divided up into what people in Palestine call Swiss cheese. So there's the holes of the Swiss cheese, and they're not really connected. There is checkpoints, there is barriers, the roads that connect one Palestinian village to another have been blocked. So it's very difficult for the Palestinian communities to get together. It's a trip that is maybe a few kilometers takes a long time, because you have to go through checkpoints and you have to leave your road, your car, by the end of your village, which is blocked off by stones, and you have to walk until on the other side when taxis are waiting for you. So the whole of the West Bank is really very divided. Israel doesn't have checkpoints. Inside Israel there is no checkpoints, so people can travel freely. So if you look at who is controlling Israel and the West Bank, it is control of one authority, and it's this Israeli authority that is de facto also controlling the West Bank. So if there is a hope for a Palestinian state, that is good, but it has to be proved on the ground that it is possible, because you cannot keep on talking about it. Right now, de facto, it's all controlled by Israel. The Palestinian Authority does not have the freedom that it should have to have a state.
For many, as there's always the argument or the so-called solutions of bringing peace to Palestine, and they always either say the two-state solution or the one-state solution. Do you think that either one would actually work to bring peace?
I think it depends on who you ask in Palestine. The older generation of Palestinians still believe in the two-state solution. The young people don't believe in that the two-state solution is possible anymore. I think the older people still have a dream that they can have a state of their own, but I think the young people don't have. The facts on the ground prove right now that it's very difficult to have a Palestinian state when you have cities, enclaves, separated by checkpoints. And will the Israelis give up these checkpoints and let the Palestinians travel freely?
But then, because with the two-state solution, we've got it that, according to like the people that have actually brought it forward, is that we'll go back to the borders back in 1967, I believe it is, where there'll be more of Palestine for the Palestinians. They would, get back their own land. So in that sense, even though, of course, now, and as you've stated, Palestine itself has, you would find a few tiny cities, and as the Palestinians say themselves, it's just like Swiss cheese. When you look at the map now, the majority of it isn't even Palestine anymore. It's gone. Mm. But then the cities that are Palestinian till today, even though they're not still one, but with a two-state solution, they believe it's going to be, going back, which is going to be more Palestine. Do you think that would actually happen?
Well, if the Israelis are willing to accept the Palestinian state on the 67 border, then there is a chance for a two-state solution. But that means the Israelis would have to give away a lot of land, a lot of control. Are they willing to do that? Right now, the indication is that they're not going that way. And
they are not going that way in the sense that, what they're doing in Jerusalem. But then when we say the one-state solution, meaning everyone being equal, the Israelis feel threatened. At the same time, when we say the two-state solution, we always have the thing of, are they willing to give up what they've already taken? So are these two solutions ever going to work, or are they just saying that to us so we just keep hoping and hoping when we know at the end of the day there isn't going to be anything?
A Palestinian state in the West Bank would give the Palestinian the authority to control over their own affairs. If the Israelis are willing to allow the Palestinians to take control of their own lives, of their own land, of their own resources, that would be very good. Right now, it doesn't seem like it's happening on the ground. On the other hand, having a one-state solution where Palestinians and Israelis are treated equally does not seem like it's going to happen either, because the Palestinians who stayed in Israel after 1948 and became Israeli citizens are still discriminated against. There is a certain number I don't know if that's 40 laws that discriminate against the Palestinians, Israelis. One of them is, many of them are hidden in a way that you don't really know that they're discriminated against Palestinian. One of them, for example, is the serving in the Israeli army. If you serve in the Israeli army, you get certain benefits. You get housing benefits, you get help in university, schools, things like that. Because the Palestinians don't serve in the Israeli army, they don't get this benefit. So it's a covered way, it's a hidden way of discriminating against Palestinians.
So even if an Israeli individual wasn't to go to the army, would they still be treated the same? Like they won't be given housing benefits and support in education and stuff like that?
The Israelis are obliged to go to the army. Everybody from the age of 18, all Israelis have to go into the army for 2 or 3 years, depending on what rank you're going, women and men. Some Israelis refuse to go into the army. They're called refuseniks, and they are thrown in jail.
Oh,
yes.
How come?
Because they're refusing to go to the army, which is illegal, so they're thrown in jail.
But then for someone to encourage people to go to the army, isn't that just causing more hatred around the world?
Around the world? Or I think there is an effort to encourage everybody to willingly go into the army. And then if they have a mind of their own and they don't want to go into the army, then they're punished for that.
So there's always consequences.
There's consequences. And recently the Israelis tried to get the Christians into the army by saying that you're not really Arab, so we will change what you have on your ID card, and you will be put, I think they said you will put Christian, or I mean they will make a difference between Christians and Muslims, so that by dividing the Christians for the Muslims, they get more support from the West, showing that, oh, but the Christians we're treating better. So far, it hasn't worked en masse. So far, the Palestinian Christians have not joined the army in big numbers. Some have, but the majority have not. And the churches are opposing that. The churches are calling for the Christians not joining the army, because they would be, playing the game of the Israelis of trying to separate the Palestinians even more. Already they're separated in 100 ways. This is one more way of separating the Palestinians.
But then to call, Arab is more of a nationality. It doesn't have anything to do with one's religion and one's belief. If you're born in the Middle East, for example, in a certain area, that means you're an Arab or you're Iranian, for example. But then to separate that from your religion, so they're trying to just basically play the whole divide and rule game even more.
Yes, the Palestinians who stayed in Israel after 1948 were not called Palestinians anymore, were called Israeli Arabs. So already then they tried to erase the name Palestinian from their vocabulary. I remember when I was living there and some of my children's friends were Israeli Palestinians, and they said, I asked them, where are you from? And they said, oh, I'm an Israeli Arab. I said, what do you mean you're an Israeli Arab? You come from which country? And he said, from here. I said, well, then you're Palestinian. And I could tell he had to, he was only, I think, 15 or 16 years old. He had to think about that. He had to think about the fact that he was actually Palestinian, because they are taught to say they're Israeli Arabs.
So they're trying to wipe out the whole Palestinian nationality.
Well, some Israelis say Palestinians never existed and they only came because they wanted to cause trouble for the Jews. So, there is many different narratives there. And but Arabs came from Arabia. Mm-hmm. And they swept, if you go to Egypt, the Copts sometimes say they're not Arabs because they are the descendants of the pharaohs. So saying Arab, non-Arab, it becomes a little bit complicated, but the Israelis like to play this game.
But then when we look throughout history, before there was a big migration to Palestine, the majority of people living in Palestine were Arab, regardless of their religion, because there were many Jews, Christians and Muslims living there. It wasn't really dominated by a certain religion. because, you know, Palestine at the end of the day, especially Jerusalem, is a very holy place for both the Muslims and the Christians. And also you've got Bethlehem as well, where Jesus was also born, so that's another like holy place for the people. So to kind of like just identify Palestine in one certain way, I don't think is right. But at the same time, when we look through history, the majority of people were living there were Arab. But if we were to go, of course, further in history, then it would be different, because we'll have to kind of like look at the more nationalities and stuff. But then looking at Palestine today, do the Christian people still believe in that holiness and hope for the Israelis to kind of like leave the Palestinians alone?
I think the hope is there. I think there is still hope, but every day it's really hard to see how it's going to materialize at the moment. But the Christians are very determined. The ones who stayed want to stay because they understand that it's important. They have like a mission to stay and remain in the land where Christianity was born. But the hardship makes it practically very difficult. I think that 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, a certain number of families were given visa to immigrate to Canada. More Christian families were given visas to immigrate to Canada and the US.
So the US is kind of playing this card so more people leave Palestine?
Well, for a very long time, the churches asked that the Christians stay. But when the situation becomes so hard that, you know, it's dangerous to send your children to university, or the Israelis come and do incursions at night or during the day, how can you don't have a space to build a new house. It becomes really difficult to have a normal life. For example, someone from Bethlehem. Bethlehem is where the majority, I'd say more than 50% of the Palestinian Christians live in the Bethlehem triangle. Bethlehem, Bet Jala, Bet Sahur. On one side there is the wall, on the other side is the settlements. So Bethlehem is really enclosed, strangled. There is no way to grow for the city of Bethlehem because it's enclosed. For them to be able to have a normal life, it means they want their children to go to school. They want them to get married, they want them to find jobs, they want them to have a house. How can you expand when, you know, as a city, as a people, when the city is closed?
It's being strangled.
It's being strangled. And this is the reason why I made the film, because I was so upset at what I saw was happening to Bethlehem. And so they decide to leave. They did that. But, you know, more Muslims than Christians leave. The problem is that Christians, because they're such a small number, it has a much bigger impact on the overall demographics, you know, the percentages of Christians and Muslims. But more Muslims leave Palestine. The difference is that Christians, when they leave, the whole family leaves and they don't come back. Muslims, they go out, they study. Young people, young women, they go out, study, and then they come back to their families. So it's there's a difference in the migration patterns between Christians and Muslims. Christians decide we leave, we all leave, and they don't come back.
How was it for you when you lived in Jerusalem?
It was a big surprise when I first moved there, because I didn't really understand what occupation means, even though I grew up in Egypt. But even in Egypt, and I think in Syria to a certain extent, there is a lot of support for the Palestinian people, but without knowing what really happened to the Palestinian people. The cleansing of the villages. I would tell Egyptians, you know, there's a certain number of villages that were demolished. No, the Palestinians, they sold the land to the Jews. So, they escaped, they were cowards. Or, I mean, it's all these things that they, like the West, has a certain narrative as to what happened. So the Arab countries also have the lack of knowledge at what really happened in Palestine in 1948. If you ask an Egyptian what's Deir Yassin, they will know. You ask a Palestinian, of course they will know. You ask an Iraqi, they don't know. And I met Iraqis, for example, after the bombing, and they became refugees. And one person I remember at one dinner said, "Now I know what the Palestinians went through. We didn't understand before." And it was very, I could tell he was very touched by, he could really connect with the Palestinians, but for the first time.
It's only when they go through the same hardship.
It's only when they, and
understand.
yes, and I think the Syrians probably can connect now. But has been so much of another story, another narrative portrayed in the West and in the Arab countries, that the story of the Palestinians themselves has not been told. They have not had a voice in telling their own story.
How do you think we can actually give them a voice? Because, like, if we're to look at the Holocaust, for example, there was Anne Frank, who's become very famous for what she's written and, her diary and everything of what was actually taking place while she was in Germany. But then why don't we actually get that perspective from the Palestinians? Because many of them have gone through a lot of hardship.
Yes, and many of them have died and written books. And I think the big shift came in September 11, when their story has always been curtailed, the Palestinian story. But since September 11th, there has been an equation with Arab, Muslim, terrorist. And so it has been difficult sometimes for people to listen to the Palestinian story and actually understand it as a human story. It's always viewed, I say, through the veil of terrorism, because everybody's, Arab terrorist. And that is why I decided to do a film from the Christian side, because when I showed the film, really, I showed it yesterday in Leicester Cathedral last night, and I've showed it in many places. When the film is finished, and it's usually Christians who come and see the film, there is silence. They're shocked. And then one of the first questions is, why didn't I know? It's like for the first time, because it's a Christian telling the story, they finally make a connection. It is really, I am a little bit surprised by the reaction that it's getting, but because for me, I grew up Christians, Muslims. We didn't really talk about who's Christian, who's Muslim when I was growing up in the 1970s. It was just not something that was talked about. And so to get this reaction, it's surprising me, but it's also making me happy, because I see that people there is a breakthrough. And it's not only with this film, there's other films that finally people are watching and maybe not thinking terrorists the whole time. What's happening in Gaza, the bombings, and the last 3 bombings have been disastrous, massacres. And I think people are stopping and thinking, these are human beings. People still think, they're all Hamas, and they're all terrorists, and they throw rockets at us. But other people are actually looking beyond that and seeing these are human beings, and they're being killed mercilessly.
Of course, and it's really unfortunate that the Muslims and the Arabs are actually generalized with the term terrorist, because that isn't what we are, and to be labeled that way is very upsetting. And it's also having an impact on many other people, like if they're Christian Arabs, they're also affected, or Jewish Arabs, they're also affected. But why do you think the media and Western powers actually imposed that label on the Muslims/Arabs?
Well, it is easier to kill someone if they're a terrorist, isn't it? Because you dehumanize them. So you take away you don't feel connected to them. And so it is okay to get rid of them.
But then, for example, in the 2003 invasion in Iraq, when the US went in and everything, the people that I actually killed and attacked were not terrorists and were not, they weren't any part of, they didn't have any connection to any terrorist group such as Al-Qaeda and any other one that was there at the time.
Wasn't that another big lie that the Americans told?
Of course it was.
Wasn't that the big lie? The inspectors today, for weeks, I would turn on the TV, it's the inspectors today. went here, went there, went everywhere, and they never found anything, and still nothing has been found. But I can tell you, when I was living in Jordan at the time, and I had an Iraqi friend, and she said, an acquaintance, and I remember she said, oh, we ran away because Saddam was doing this and this to us, and my uncle was forced to go to this underground city where he has to be blindfolded to be taken there, and he's working on chemicals. They were telling this so that they could get out and get a visa to America. So the Iraqis themselves trying to get out of Iraq were actually not making things easier. Of course, there is the famous witness. There's this girl in Kuwait who then was, she was lying, but she said how when the Iraqis came, they threw babies out of the incubators and things like that. It's a famous thing I think it's either in front of Congress, or it's a testimony by an Iraqi woman.
Interesting.
No, Iraqi, Kuwaiti women. I think she was a nurse or something. She was working in a hospital. I don't remember now what nationality she was, but she was found to be lying. It was all a big lie. Like the bombs and the weapons and the... Saddam Hussein didn't have any of these things. And still, if he had, they would have been found now. It was all a big lie to be able to take over the country and the oil. And the people were just caught in the middle of the grinding stone, and who cares?
But then that kind of, because you said that the Palestinians are not seen as human, just like the Israelis would. But then it's something that we see in all of the Middle East in a way. It's not only the Palestinians, and what the Palestinians are facing is very, it's very tragic and it's very upsetting, especially that we're in the West, and however much we protest and however much we write articles, it's not really pushing our government as much to actually help the Palestinians. But when we look at the Middle East as a whole, like what's taking place in Iraq and in Syria, all of the Arabs are not actually seen as human, because the amount of people that are being killed every single day is it's unbelievable.
I can tell you, watch where the money is. Last weekend I was in Holland and I watched a film by an Israeli called The Lab, and it talks about the Israeli military industry and the amount of money that is coming into Israel from the exporting of weapons that have been tested on Gaza. Yes. This week there is another arms fair in Tel Aviv. After 2012 there was one. After 2009 there was one. Countries from all over the world, countries that don't even have diplomatic relationship with Israel, like Malaysia and Indonesia, still come and look at the weapons because they've been tested on people. So
Israel kind of like makes these weapons and then causes a fight, conflict, in a way, just to test its weapons.
It would appear so, wouldn't it?
Yeah, because that's what I've understood from what you're saying.
The documentary The Lab really shows how, and this is an Israeli filmmaker who did this investigative documentary. It really shows the reason for wars and what comes out of wars. So from wars, it's just really mainly making Israel stronger and stronger, economically speaking. Yes, the arms industry has skyrocketed since the attacks on Gaza.
Meaning that's actually benefited Israel a lot.
Yes, they are exporting all the weapons that they have tested on the Palestinians, and other countries are importing them. The end of the film, I think, ends in Brazil, where the Israeli arms dealer is selling the weapons to crush some, people that are opposing to them. But
why do they need all these weapons? Like, when thinking about it, you mentioned Brazil, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Why would they invest a lot of money? And I imagine it's mainly, the country's money in weapons which, being an optimistic, hopefully they would never use. Okay, but then there's nothing ahead in the future now, in this present time, they're saying that these type of countries would actually need weapons.
But they might, to keep control. To keep control, you have to be strong.
So they invest in all this money just in case?
Just in case, or some actually practically use them. I think in demonstrations they use them. In South America, I think it's very common that they use these weapons against their own people. I think in Mexico, didn't they kidnap like 44 students a month or so ago? And there is repression of people, and they need weapons that have been tested, and you know what the effects of these weapons are on the people and on the crowds.
So in a way, instead of a lot of countries helping the Palestinians and supporting them in what's taking place in Palestine, they're actually supporting Israel in the sense that they're buying a lot of weapons from them.
I think if you want to stay in power, you'll do anything to stay in power.
This is where greed comes in as well. And humans tend to forget their morality.
Yes, definitely. I think that the humanity of people is being forgotten. The innocent people. I call it the film is the story of the unimportant people in their daily lives. But to them, to a Palestinian mother whose son was just blinded or daughter was just killed, it's a tragedy.
Of course.
For everybody else, it's just not even a headline in the news.
Of course, because they don't really know about it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Thank you very much for joining us on the show, and thank you very much for watching Beneath the Surface. See you next time.